Never thought I'd be the kind of person who checks his phone every 20 minutes just to make sure no one has walked through his own front door. But here I am, 52 years old, refreshing a security app like it's a nervous habit I can't shake. My name is Walter Peck, and I'm an offshore pipeline inspector for an oil and gas company out of St. John's, Newfoundland. The work takes me to platforms off the Hibernia field, sometimes the Jeanne d'Arc Basin, rotating schedules that put me on a helicopter every 3 weeks. 2 weeks on, 1 week off. More or less, though more or less usually means more. I've been doing this since I was 31. My marriage didn't survive it. My ex-wife Diane said she felt like a widow who got reminded every few weeks that her husband was still alive. She wasn't wrong. We split 7 years ago. No kids, no drama, just two people who'd grown apart across too many absences. After the divorce, I bought a townhouse in Mount Pearl just south of St. John's. Modest place, 2 stories, small backyard, detached garage. It's the kind of neighborhood where people know each other's cars and wave from driveways. I liked that. I liked knowing my neighbors had eyes on things when I was away. Or at least, I thought I liked it. I thought it was enough. I was 3 days into a 2-week rotation in late September when my phone buzzed with a call from a number I almost didn't answer. It was the condo association administrator for my street, a woman named Paulette, who I'd spoken to maybe twice before about gutter maintenance fees. "Walter, sorry to catch you at a bad time," she said. Her voice had that particular tone, apologetic but deliberate, like she'd been rehearsing this. "I got a flag from Newfoundland Power. Your electricity consumption has spiked pretty significantly. I'm talking nearly 3 times your average over the past 6 weeks." I was in the cafeteria on the platform. I put down my coffee. "That doesn't make any sense. I'm not even there." "I know. That's why I'm calling." She paused. "There's something else. Your neighbor 2 doors down, Mr. Fagan. He mentioned to me last week that he's seen lights on at your place quite a bit at night. He figured you'd come back early from a rotation and just hadn't said anything. But when I checked the schedule you filed with us for emergency contact purposes, you're supposed to be away until mid-October." "I haven't come back early," I said. "I haven't told anyone to be there." Another pause. "Walter, I think you should come home and see what's going on." I finished the shift because I had no choice. You can't just walk off a platform, you wait for the helicopter, but I barely slept for the 2 days it took to arrange an early relief and get myself back to St. John's. I kept running through scenarios in my head. Had I left something on? A space heater, maybe? But that didn't explain lights at night. A break-in? But break-ins don't usually involve people settling in for 6 weeks. I landed at St. John's International on a Tuesday morning. I didn't take a cab home. Instead, I called my buddy from the platform rotation, a guy named Phil who lives in Paradise and owes me a few favors, and borrowed his truck, a dark blue F-150 that nobody on my street would recognize. I drove past my townhouse slowly. Nothing looked wrong from the outside. The blinds I'd left half open were fully closed. I told myself that could be the wind. I drove around the block and parked on the street behind mine and sat there for a while, just watching, feeling faintly ridiculous. Then at 6:14 in the evening, my kitchen light came on. I hadn't left it on a timer. I don't use timers. I just stood up straight in the driver's seat and stared at that rectangle of light like it was something impossible. Like a lit window in a house that should have been empty was somehow evidence against the laws of physics. Someone was in there. Every part of me wanted to walk up to the front door and find out who. I had 25 years of offshore work behind me. I'm not a small man, and this was my house. But something stopped me. The same instinct that makes you double-check a pressure gauge before you trust it. Something methodical. I drove to Phil's place instead and called the non-emergency line from his kitchen. The constable I reached was patient. He explained that without visible evidence of forced entry, without being able to prove the person inside hadn't been given permission, it was complicated. They could send a car, But if whoever was there produced a key and claimed they were house-sitting or claimed they had some arrangement with me, it became a civil matter until they could establish otherwise. He wasn't dismissive. He was just honest. "So what do you suggest?" I asked. "Document it," he said. "Cameras if you can manage it. A clear record of unauthorized entry. That gives us something to work with." I thanked him and spent the next morning at a shop on Torbay Road buying 4 wireless cameras, a video doorbell, and a tablet to monitor the feeds. The kind that backs up to the cloud automatically, the kind where even if someone finds the hardware and takes it, the footage is already stored somewhere they can't reach. That afternoon, I waited until I was reasonably certain the house was empty. I'd been watching from Phil's truck and the lights had been off since mid-morning, and I let myself in through the back door with my key. The smell hit me first. Not bad, just different. Someone else's cooking, something with garlic and onion that I hadn't made, clinging to the walls the way smells do in small spaces. I stood in the kitchen and looked around and felt something I don't have a clean word for. Not anger exactly, not fear. More like the particular wrongness of seeing your private world slightly off-axis. The dish rack had dishes in it I didn't own, 2 plates, a mug with a cartoon moose on it. There was a box of red rose tea on the counter next to my kettle. I drink coffee. I don't own red rose tea. I walked through the house slowly. The living room had been rearranged slightly. Just enough. The couch was a few inches off its usual position. There was a folded blanket on the armchair that I recognized as mine, the one I kept in the hallway closet, but it had been moved out and used. On the coffee table, a crumpled Tim Hortons bag. The bathroom, an extra razor on the edge of the tub, a brand of shampoo I didn't use. The spare bedroom, the one with the pull-out couch I'd never bothered to replace with a real bed. The pull-out was fully extended and made up. There was a nylon duffel bag in the corner, partially unzipped, clothes folded inside. Someone wasn't just getting into my house. Someone was living in it. I set the cameras up quickly and carefully. Living room, kitchen, hallway, and the doorbell camera facing the front. I tucked the indoor ones behind objects, tested the angles on my phone, and left everything else exactly as I'd found it. Same position for the couch. I even refolded the blanket on the armchair the way it had been. I locked up and drove back to Phil's and sat at his kitchen table with the tablet in front of me and waited. At 4:50 that afternoon, the doorbell camera triggered. A man, mid-40s I'd guess, though it's hard to say precisely. Medium build, dark jacket, a canvas tote bag over one shoulder. He walked up to my front door with no hesitation at all, not the walk of someone doing something wrong, but the walk of someone completely at ease. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a key. He let himself into my house the way I let myself into my house. I watched through the camera feeds as he went straight to the kitchen, filled the kettle, leaned against the counter while it boiled, and then took his mug, the cartoon moose mug, to the couch and turned on my television. He watched the news for a while. Then he made dinner. I watched him cook in my kitchen like it was the most natural thing in the world. Over the following 3 days, I documented everything. He arrived in the late afternoon on a predictable schedule. He was quiet, almost considerate. He washed his dishes. He didn't leave lights blazing. He locked the door behind him. He slept on the pull-out in the spare room. At one point, he was on a phone call and I could see him gesturing, but the audio was too muffled to make out. On the 3rd day, a second person showed up. A woman, maybe late 30s, pulling a rolling carry-on. She knocked, which surprised me. She clearly didn't have a key. The man answered and let her in. I watched them talk at the door, relaxed and familiar. She brought her bag upstairs to the spare room. Then they sat at my kitchen table with a laptop open between them. I maxed out the camera zoom and sat forward in Phil's chair, squinting at the screen like I was trying to read a map in bad light. I could make out a document on the laptop, a booking confirmation of some kind. There was a logo in the upper corner I couldn't fully read, but I recognized the general layout. I'd used Airbnb before, years ago, for a trip to Halifax. I knew what a booking page looked like. I went straight to Airbnb and typed in my address. There it was, Cozy Mount Pearl Retreat, quiet residential neighborhood. Photos of my living room, my kitchen, my backyard with the little deck I'd built 3 summers ago. The listing described a thoughtfully furnished home, perfect for extended stays, with easy access to downtown St. Liding, John's, and the Avalon Mall. The nightly rate was $195. It had 11 reviews. The oldest was dated 8 weeks ago. They were all 5 stars. I read a few of the reviews with my hands shaking slightly. Host was very responsive to messages, felt completely at home, spotlessly clean, highly recommend for anyone visiting the area. Host, they were describing this man, this stranger who'd been sleeping in my spare room and drinking tea from a cartoon moose mug, as the host of my property. I started searching. The listing had a host profile with a photo, blurry enough that I almost dismissed it, but it matched the man I'd been watching on my cameras. I reverse image searched it and got a partial hit on a LinkedIn profile for a man named Douglas Farrell, who described himself as a short-term accommodation specialist based in the Avalon Peninsula. Douglas Farrell. I stared at that name for a long time. His LinkedIn was thin, no employer listed, just the description and a few vague endorsements. His Facebook was set to private, but his Instagram wasn't. Under a profile that mixed photos of food and scenic Newfoundland coastline, there were occasional shots of what were clearly interiors of different homes. Captioned things like, "Another great listing" and "Beautiful space in the East End." The homes were different. He wasn't just running one unauthorized rental. The woman with the carry-on turned out to be harder to identify, but I got lucky on day 4. The doorbell camera picked up their conversation as she was leaving, and this time the audio was clear enough. "We've got 2 more bookings before the end of the month," Douglas said. "We need to be out by the 28th, she said. I confirmed that with Gerald. The owner comes back the 29th. The 29th. That was when I'd originally scheduled my return. But I was already here, watching. I kept moving on Gerald. It nagged at me all through that evening. How did Douglas have a key? How did he know when I'd be gone? I paid a property services company to check on my place during long rotations, just periodic walkthroughs, a quick visual inspection, make sure there was no water damage or anything catastrophic. I'd hired them 3 years ago after a pipe had frozen during a January rotation. They had a spare key. They had my rotation schedule. I always gave it to them in advance so they knew when to do the checks. I went through every photo and camera clip I had. I slowed down the footage from the second day and looked at every frame of Douglas's comings and goings. And there, late morning, while I'd been watching from Phil's truck, a second man had arrived, older, maybe 60, driving a white pickup. He and Douglas stood on my front step and talked for about 4 minutes, then shook hands and the older man left. The truck had a logo on the door. I got a clear still from the doorbell camera and zoomed in. Atlantic Keystone Property Services, the company I paid to look after my home. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I called the company's main line and asked to speak with someone about their staff. A woman answered, pleasant, professional. I told her I was a long-term client and I'd had someone from their team over recently and wanted to send a compliment. Could she tell me who covered the Mount Pearl area? That would be Ted, she said. Ted Boudreau. He's been with us about 4 years. Ted Boudreau. I thanked her and hung up. I called Paulette from the condo association that same afternoon and told her everything. She went quiet for a long moment on the other end. Walter, she said finally, you need to go to the RCMP with this. I'm going, I said. But I need to know, have any other owners on the street had issues, utility spikes, anything like that? She said she'd make some calls. 2 hours later, she called me back. 2 other homeowners on adjacent streets had flagged unusual utility bills in the past 3 months. One had even received a noise complaint from a neighbor about unfamiliar people coming and going, both owned by people who traveled frequently for work. It wasn't just me. I went to the RCMP detachment on Topsail Road with my tablet, my phone, a folder of printed screenshots, and a USB drive with every hour of footage I'd collected. The corporal who took my case was a woman named Sist Fury, calm and thorough. She reviewed what I had and called in a colleague partway through. "Mr. Peck," she said afterward, "you've put together a strong evidentiary record. What you're describing is fraud, unauthorized use of a dwelling, breach of trust, and potentially theft of services. If there's an employee of a property services company who facilitated this, that's a serious aggravating factor." "There are at least 2 other properties," I said, "maybe more." She nodded. "We'll need to look at those." Over the next 2 weeks, the RCMP built the case. They identified Douglas Farrell, full legal name Douglas Raymond Farrell, as the operator of a small network of unauthorized short-term rentals, all of them in homes belonging to people who worked away regularly. The woman with the carry-on was identified as his girlfriend, who handled the Airbnb messaging and guest communications, the reviews, the listings, the photos, all her work. Ted Boudreau had been feeding Douglas information for 8 months. He got 25% of the rental income from each property. In total, across 3 homes including mine, the operation had generated just over $61,000. From my property alone, Douglas had collected more than $19,000. $19,000 from my home, while I was working offshore to pay the mortgage on it. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning in late November. I wasn't there for it. The RCMP didn't want me anywhere near the property until it was done, but Sista Fury called me when it was over. Douglas was arrested at my front door when he arrived for what he believed was a regular afternoon. His girlfriend was picked up separately at an apartment in the East End. Ted Boudreau was arrested at an Atlantic Keystone job site in Conception Bay, South. The charges: fraud over $5,000, unauthorized use of a dwelling, and conspiracy for all 3. For Ted, an additional charge of breach of trust. The trial stretched into the following spring. The way these things do, I had to take time off rotation to testify, which my company was decent about, though there was paperwork. The prosecutor walked me through the footage, hour by hour, and I sat in the witness box and described what it was like to watch a stranger make dinner in my kitchen and fold himself into my couch with my television remote and my blanket. Douglas's lawyer tried to argue that the guests who'd booked through Airbnb had done so in good faith, that the platform itself had facilitated the transaction, that the question of criminal intent was murkier than the Crown was suggesting. The judge was not persuaded. Douglas received 26 months in provincial custody and 5 years of probation. His girlfriend received 14 months in probation. Ted Boudreau, who cooperated with investigators once it became clear the evidence was overwhelming, received a conditional sentence, house arrest, probation, and a permanent prohibition from any position involving access to private properties. All 3 were ordered to pay restitution to the 3 affected homeowners. My portion came to just under $12,000, which covered the months of inflated utility bills, the cost of rekeying every lock in the house, the security system I installed afterward, and some of the legal costs I'd accumulated. It didn't cover the other things. The feeling of walking through your front door and wondering for weeks afterward if the smell was yours or someone else's. The way I couldn't sit on my own couch without thinking about Douglas Farrell sitting on it first. The afternoon I found a phone charger behind the nightstand in the spare room, his, left behind, and had to go outside and stand in the backyard for 10 minutes before I could go back inside. Atlantic Keystone Property Services terminated Ted Boudreau immediately and issued a statement about their zero tolerance for breach of client trust. 3 of us filed civil suits against the company itself, arguing insufficient oversight. It settled out of court. I can't discuss the amount, but it was meaningful. I sold the townhouse 14 months after the arrests. I told myself it was just time for a change, that I'd been thinking about it before any of this happened. That was partially true. But the real reason was simpler. I'd walk through the rooms and see him. See the mug on the counter. See the made-up pull-out in the spare room. The place had been mine, and then it had been borrowed without permission, and I couldn't seem to get it back all the way. I bought a condo in a building in downtown St. John's with a key fob entry system, a concierge at the desk during business hours, and cameras in every common area. I have 4 cameras inside my unit and a video doorbell that sends a notification to my phone every time someone walks past in the hallway. My coworkers on the platform tease me about it. One of the guys calls me the surveillance king. I don't mind. What I've learned, the things I wish I'd understood before October of that year. Check your home's utility bills regularly, even when you're away. Set up an online account with your power company and enable alerts for unusual consumption. That spike in my electricity was the first sign something was wrong, and I nearly missed it because I wasn't paying attention. If you travel for work and own property, tell your immediate neighbors explicitly, not just that you're away, but that no one should be there, and that if they see any activity, they shouldn't hesitate to call you directly. Mr. Thagan mentioned the lights to Paulette, not to me, because we'd never established that kind of relationship. If I'd given him my number and said, "Call me if you ever see anything odd," this might have ended 6 weeks earlier. Any company that holds a key to your home and knows your schedule is holding something more valuable than they probably realize. Not all of them have the right safeguards. Ask about staff vetting. Ask who specifically has access to your file, your key, your schedule. If they can't answer those questions clearly, find another company. Search your property's address on short-term rental platforms once in a while. Airbnb, Vrbo, others. It takes 2 minutes, and the idea that someone would list your home without your knowledge seems absurd until you're staring at photos of your own kitchen with a 5-star rating and reviews talking about how great the host is. Install cameras. I know how that sounds. I know it feels like a thing you do after you've been burned, not before. But the cameras were the only reason I had a criminal prosecution instead of a civil dispute that went nowhere. Without the footage, it would have been my word against Douglas's claim that we'd had some informal arrangement. The cameras made it unarguable. And finally, if something feels wrong, act on it. Don't rationalize it. Don't tell yourself there's probably an innocent explanation. I lost 2 days on the platform talking myself out of what I already knew. Trust the instinct that makes you pick up the phone. The other 2 homeowners who'd been affected, I got to know them a bit through the legal process. One was a nurse who worked contract rotations up north. A woman in her 40s who'd come home to find a family of 4 had just checked out of her bungalow. She found a children's coloring book under the couch. She said that was the part that got her somehow. The domestic ordinariness of it. Strangers had been a family in her home doing family things and had no idea they were guests without an invitation. The other was a man about my age who worked for a mining company and traveled to sites in Labrador. He was the one whose personal documents had been gone through. He found one of his old tax returns in a kitchen drawer where he hadn't left it. He spent months working with his accountant and a credit monitoring service to make sure nothing had been opened in his name. As far as he could tell, nothing had, but he would never fully be sure, and that uncertainty became its own kind of burden. I think about that sometimes, how this kind of crime doesn't fit the image we have of crime. Nothing was smashed. No window was broken. From the outside, it looked like a normal house with someone inside living a normal life. That's what made it feel so much worse in some ways. It was intimate. It was patient. Someone had decided that my home, my private space, the place I came back to after 2 weeks in the North Atlantic, was worth less than what they could charge per night for it. They'd done the math, and the math worked out to around $195 a night, plus cleaning fees. I drive past the townhouse occasionally when I'm in Mount Pearl visiting a friend. There's a young couple living there now. I've seen them in the driveway a few times. A dog, bikes leaning against the garage. The backyard deck I built is still there. It looks like it's being used and looked after. I hope they don't know what happened in that house, and I hope, if something ever feels wrong, they listen to it anyway. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes over you when you realize the place you work to keep, the place you return to after 2 weeks in the North Atlantic wind, has been treated like a commodity by someone who never once thought of you as a person. I think about that a lot. Not the money, not even the legal outcome, just that calculation. Douglas Farrell looked at my home, my mortgage, my private space, and saw a nightly rate. $195 plus cleaning fees. That was what my life on the road was worth to him. What I've come to understand is that what happened to me wasn't random bad luck. There was a chain to it, and every link in that chain was a choice someone made. Ted chose to betray a client's trust for a cut of something he knew was wrong. Douglas chose to build a business on the backs of people who were too far away to notice. And I chose to trust systems without verifying them, to hand over a key and a schedule, and assume that was enough. I'm not saying I deserved what happened. I'm saying that outcomes follow from decisions, including the passive ones, the decision not to check, the decision not to ask questions. Those count too. What saved me in the end wasn't luck. It was the decision to slow down when every instinct was telling me to rush forward. When I saw that kitchen light come on, I could have gone straight to the front door. I could have confronted Douglas in the moment and had nothing. No footage, no documentation, no case. Instead, I drove away and spent a night thinking clearly about what I actually needed and what the most effective path forward looked like. That discipline, the ability to hold yourself back when your emotions are running hot, to think past the immediate reaction, that's what built the evidentiary record that put 3 people in front of a judge. I'm also aware that I had to be honest with myself throughout this process in ways that weren't comfortable. I had to admit that I'd been careless, that I'd handed a company access to my home and my schedule without asking nearly enough questions about who, specifically, would be holding that access. It's easy to feel purely victimized by something like this, and you are a victim, genuinely. But there's also a harder conversation you have to have with yourself about the gaps you left open. Having that conversation and not looking away from your own role in the conditions that made the crime possible is how you actually protect yourself going forward. It's not self-blame, it's honesty. And then there's the matter of seeing it through. Months of legal process, testifying, taking time off rotation, navigating paperwork, sitting in that witness box and describing hour after hour of footage while Douglas's lawyer tried to reframe the whole thing. It would have been easier to settle quietly, to take some minimal restitution and move on. Some people do. I understand why. But the other homeowners, the nurse who found a stranger's coloring book under her couch, the man who spent months checking his credit after someone went through his tax returns, they deserved to have someone follow through. And honestly, so did I. If this story means anything, I think it's this. The safety of your home doesn't maintain itself. It requires your attention, your judgment, and when something goes wrong, your willingness to be methodical instead of just reactive. Those aren't dramatic qualities, they're quiet ones. But they're the ones that actually work.